I'm the youngest of 7, and just found out I'm the only one who was adopted. My entire life was built on a lie that everyone in my family knew except me. Hey, everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Samantha, and at 32 years old, I've always prided myself on being the youngest of 7 siblings in what I thought was a close-knit, loving family. Growing up in our bustling suburban home in Ohio, there was never a dull moment with 6 older brothers and sisters. Our family photos lined the hallway walls, documenting birthdays, holidays, and milestones, all of us smiling, arms wrapped around each other, the picture of perfect familial harmony. As the baby of the family, I often felt both protected and slightly on the outside of inside jokes and shared memories that predated my existence. My siblings, ranging from 35 to 42 years old, had formed their alliances and dynamics long before I could walk or talk. Still, I never questioned my place in the family constellation. I was Samantha, the youngest, the artistic one, the quiet observer who documented our family's history through photography and journaling. It was this love of family history that led me to order a DNA test kit on a whim last spring. The company was running a special promotion, and I thought it would be fascinating to see our genetic heritage mapped out. I imagined sharing the results at our upcoming family reunion, showing everyone what regions of the world our ancestors came from. When the package arrived, I excitedly posted a picture of it on our family group chat, mentioning how cool it would be if we all got tested to compare our DNA. My older sister Catherine immediately responded that she and her husband had done those tests last year. My brother Michael chimed in that he wasn't interested in sharing his genetic information with some corporation. The others gave lukewarm responses, but I was undeterred. I followed the instructions carefully, spit into the tube, sealed it, and mailed it back, anticipating the email that would arrive in 6 to 8 weeks with the secrets of my ancestry. 2 months later, the notification appeared in my inbox. Your DNA results are ready. I clicked through immediately, expecting to see a map of European countries with percentages next to each one. Instead, I was greeted with a message that would shatter my reality. We found 0 DNA matches with any of the family members you've indicated as relatives in your profile. Confused, I rechecked the information I had submitted. No, I had definitely marked all 6 of my siblings correctly. Perhaps there was a mistake with the testing company? I reached out to customer service, explaining that my results seemed impossible. They assured me their testing was 99.9% accurate and suggested that perhaps there might be something in my family history I wasn't aware of. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every family gathering, every photo, every memory I had ever cherished. Was it possible that my siblings and I weren't biologically related? The idea seemed absurd. We looked similar. All of us had our mother's dark brown eyes and our father's thick, wavy hair. Well, most of us did. I had always thought my hair was a bit straighter than everyone else's, and my eyes were more hazel than brown, but I had attributed that to being a genetic outlier. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As I pulled into their driveway, I noticed my mother pruning roses in the front garden. She looked up and waved, her smile genuine as always. How could I even broach such a topic? How could I ask the question that might destroy everything I thought I knew about myself? I walked into the house, the DNA results printed and clutched in my hand. My father was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside him. They both looked at me expectantly, waiting to hear what had brought me over unannounced on a Tuesday morning. I took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next would change our family forever. The kitchen felt unusually warm as I stood before my parents, the printed DNA report crinkling in my sweaty palms. My mother, Eleanor, wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for me to sit at the oak table where my father, Robert, had already lowered his newspaper. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed disconnected from the gravity of what I was about to reveal. I took one of those DNA tests. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Just for fun, to see our ancestry. I slid the papers across the table, my finger pointing to the highlighted section that indicated zero genetic connection to any of my siblings. My mother's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's expression remained unreadable as he picked up the report, his eyes scanning the document slowly, deliberately. The silence stretched into what felt like an eternity, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a family heirloom that had supposedly belonged to my great-grandfather. "Samantha," my father finally said, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. Regret? Resignation? "We need to tell you something." What followed was a conversation that unraveled my entire existence. They explained that they had adopted me when I was just 3 days old from a hospital in a neighboring state. They had always intended to tell me, they claimed, but the time never seemed right. Then more years passed. It became harder to bring up, until eventually, it felt like it would be cruel to drop such a revelation on a child who had never known anything else. As they spoke, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind, taking on new meanings. The faint comments from relatives about how I didn't quite look like the others. The times when family stories would start with "remember when we all," and then someone would glance at me and awkwardly amend to "when most of us." The way my mother would sometimes look at me with an expression of profound sadness that I had never understood. The most painful revelation came when my mother, tears streaming down her face, admitted that they had always treated me differently from their biological children. "We love you, Samantha," she insisted, "but we knew from the beginning that you weren't ours in the same way." She explained that they had set up college funds for all my siblings, but not for me. When I had worked 2 jobs throughout college to pay my tuition, they had praised my work ethic, while knowing full well that my siblings' educations had been fully financed. The family heirlooms, the grandmother's jewelry, the grandfather's watch, the antique furniture that had been promised to each child according to birth order. None of it had ever been intended for me. I sat there, stunned, as they detailed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways they had kept me separate. The family trips I was sometimes excluded from because there wasn't enough room. The extracurricular activities they hadn't supported financially because they wanted me to learn the value of earning things yourself. Even the pet names they used for me were different. My siblings were our baby, our pride and joy, while I was always just Samantha. The most devastating part was learning that this wasn't just my parents' secret. "All your siblings know," my father admitted, not meeting my eyes. "We told them when you were young, explaining that you were special because you were chosen. We asked them not to treat you differently, but children notice things." I left their house in a daze. The printed DNA report now feeling like a death certificate for the person I thought I was. The 30-minute drive back to my apartment was a blur of trees and traffic lights, my mind racing with questions. Who was I if not Samantha, the youngest of 7? Where did I come from? And most painfully, how could the people I loved most in the world have kept such a fundamental truth from me for my entire life? The days following my parents' confession passed in a surreal haze. I called in sick to work, unable to face the world with this new, fractured identity. My apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell where I was forced to confront the reality of my situation. Every family photograph on my walls seemed to mock me. Images of a family that wasn't mine, people who weren't my blood, smiling at a girl who didn't belong. My mind kept replaying my childhood with this new perspective. I remember my 8th birthday, when my siblings all received bicycles from our grandparents, while I was given a second-hand scooter that my father had fixed up. At the time, I had been thrilled with my custom ride, not realizing it was a hand-me-down from a neighbor's child. I thought about the family genealogy book my mother had created, complete with birth certificates and baby photos for each child, except for me, whose page contained only a single photo and the words "adopted 1991. The more I reflected, the more instances of differential treatment became apparent. My brothers had all been taught to drive by our father in the family car, while I had to pay for driving lessons myself. When my sister Catherine got married, our parents paid for the entire wedding. When I mentioned possibly getting engaged a few years ago, my mother had casually remarked that weddings were so expensive and perhaps I should consider a small courthouse ceremony. What hurt most was the realization that these weren't just oversights or coincidences. They were deliberate choices made by people who knew I wasn't their biological child and treated me accordingly. I had spent my life trying to earn their love and approval, never understanding that I was playing a game with rules I didn't know existed. After 3 days of isolation, I knew I needed more answers. I drove back to my parents' house, this time prepared with specific questions. My mother met me at the door, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she hadn't slept since our last conversation. We sat in the same kitchen as before, but this time I was ready for the truth, no matter how painful. I asked about the circumstances of my adoption. My father explained that they had struggled with infertility after having their sixth child. They had always wanted a large family and had considered adoption, but the process seemed daunting. Then, through a connection in the hospital where my mother worked part-time as a nurse, they learned about a newborn who needed a home immediately. The birth mother was very young, my mother said softly, twisting a dish towel in her hands. 17 years old, from a difficult family situation. She wanted you to have a better life than she could provide. They brought me home when I was 3 days old, naming me Samantha after my paternal grandmother. The plan was always to tell me the truth when I was old enough to understand. But as time passed, they became more attached, and the thought of me feeling different from their other children became too painful to contemplate. We worried you would feel like an outsider, my father admitted. Ironically, by trying to protect you from that feeling, we created it in other ways. I asked why they hadn't treated me the same as their biological children if they truly loved me. This question seemed to hit them hardest. My mother broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. My father put his arm around her, his own eyes glistening with tears. "There is always this fear," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Fear that you might leave us someday to find your birth family. Fear that the investment we made in you wouldn't be returned in the same way. It wasn't rational, and it wasn't fair to you, but it was there." They explained that they had set aside money for each biological child's education, home down payment, and wedding, traditional milestones they felt obligated to support. With me, they held back, subconsciously maintaining a distance they thought would protect them from potential hurt. As I listened, a complex mix of emotions washed over me. Anger at their deception, pity for their insecurities, and a profound sadness for the little girl who had grown up feeling slightly off-center without understanding why. I left their house that day with more clarity, but also more questions, knowing that the next conversation I needed to have was with my siblings, the 6 people who had watched me grow up knowing a truth I didn't. The confrontation with my siblings was something I had been dreading more than anything. If my parents' betrayal was painful, the complicity of my brothers and sisters felt like a deeper wound. I decided to invite them all to my apartment, creating a neutral territory where I wouldn't feel like the outsider in what had been my childhood home. One by one, they arrived that Saturday afternoon. Catherine, the eldest of 42, came first, carrying a bottle of wine as she always did. Michael and David, the 2 oldest brothers, arrived together, their usual easy banter feeling hollow to me now. The twins, Jennifer and Jessica, came next, followed by Matthew, the sibling closest to me in age. The 7 of us hadn't all been in the same room without our parents in years, and the irony of this reunion wasn't lost on me. As they settled into my living room, making small talk about jobs and relationships, I felt a strange detachment watching these people who were no longer my siblings in the biological sense. When the last person had arrived and poured themselves a drink, I stood up, my heart pounding against my ribs. "I know," I said simply, my voice surprisingly steady. About the adoption, the reactions were immediate and varied. Catherine's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The twins exchanged guilty glances. Matthew, who had always been my closest ally, looked down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken by Jennifer, who always had the bluntest tongue among us. "How did you find out?" she asked, not with concern, but with what sounded like annoyance that their secret had been exposed. I explained about the DNA test, watching as realization dawned on their faces. What followed was a difficult, emotional conversation that peeled back layers of decades-long deception. Each sibling had a different explanation for why they hadn't told me. Catherine, as the eldest, took the most responsibility. Mom and Dad sat us all down when you were about 5, she explained. They told us you were adopted and that we shouldn't treat you differently, but also not to mention it unless you brought it up first. As we got older, it just became this thing we didn't talk about. Michael was more defensive. It wasn't our secret to tell, he insisted. That was between you and Mom and Dad. We were respecting their wishes. David, the quietest of my brothers, offered a more honest perspective. I think we were afraid of how you'd react. Would you still love us? Would you want to find your real family and leave us behind? It was easier to just pretend everything was normal. The twins admitted they had forgotten about it for long periods, only remembering when something would highlight the differences between us. Remember when you needed that medical history for that school trip? Jessica asked. We all panicked because none of us knew what to tell you. But it was Matthew's confession that hurt the most. As the sibling closest to me in age, we had shared secrets throughout childhood and adolescence. I had always counted on him as my confidant and ally. I knew, he admitted, not looking at me. And sometimes I felt guilty, especially when you'd talk about how much you looked like Dad or how you had Mom's artistic talent. But I was just a kid when they told us, and it became normal to me. I'm sorry, Sam. I really am. As they spoke, memories resurfaced with new clarity. I remember the time I was sick and needed a blood transfusion, how Catherine had rushed to the hospital to be tested as a match before anyone remembered that, of course, she wouldn't be. I thought about the family tree project in 6th grade that my mother had helped me with, carefully crafting a fictional lineage while knowing the truth. The most painful realization was that my entire relationship with my siblings had been built on this foundation of secrecy. Every inside joke, every shared confidence, every moment of sibling solidarity was now tainted by the knowledge that they were keeping something so fundamental from me. By the time they left, hours later, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. The easy camaraderie we had once shared was replaced by awkward politeness and unspoken questions. As I cleaned up the empty glasses and wine bottles, I understood that I had lost not just my parents' honesty, but also the uncomplicated relationships I had once had with my siblings. In discovering the truth about my adoption, I had become an outsider in the only family I had ever known. The weeks after confronting my family were a period of intense introspection and decision-making. I found myself oscillating between anger at their deception and a desperate need to understand my origins. The question that kept me awake at night was simple yet profound. Who am I? My apartment became a command center for my search. I created a detailed timeline of what I knew about my adoption, which wasn't much. Born on March 15th, 1991, at St. Mary's Hospital in Toledo, Ohio. Adopted 3 days later by Robert and Eleanor Mitchell. That was it, the entirety of my known history. My first step was to request my original birth certificate and adoption records from the state of Ohio. The process was more complicated than I anticipated. Ohio had only recently changed its laws to allow adoptees access to their original birth certificates, and there was still a bureaucratic maze to navigate. I filled out forms, paid fees, and waited, each passing day increasing my anxiety. While waiting for the official documents, I turned to DNA testing websites, uploading my results to multiple platforms. I created a profile emphasizing my search for biological family and my birth circumstances. Within days, I started receiving messages from distant genetic cousins, 4th and 5th cousins who shared small segments of DNA with me. Though none were close relatives, they provided valuable clues about my genetic heritage. Most pointed to Eastern European ancestry, particularly Polish and Ukrainian roots, which contradicted the predominantly Irish and English background of my adoptive family. 2 months after submitting my request, a thick envelope arrived from the Ohio Department of Health. With trembling hands, I opened it to find my original birth certificate. There, typed under mother's name, was the information I had been seeking. Anna Kowalski, age 17, born in Pennsylvania. Under father's name, the box was marked unknown. The certificate listed Anna's address as a group home for unwed mothers in Toledo. This was the breakthrough I needed. I now had a name and a starting point. My search focused on Anna Kowalski, a 17-year-old who had been in a Toledo group home in 1991. The internet yielded limited results. There were dozens of Anna Kowalskis in Pennsylvania and Ohio. I needed more information. I decided to contact the group home mentioned on the birth certificate. After several phone calls and emails, I connected with a social worker who had worked there in the early 1990s. Though she couldn't share specific details due to confidentiality laws, she confirmed that a young woman named Anna Kowalski had indeed been there in 1991 and had placed a child for adoption. She also shared that Anna had returned to Pennsylvania after giving birth and that the group home had lost contact with her. Armed with this information, I expanded my search to Pennsylvania. I spent countless hours on genealogy websites, public records, and social media platforms. I reached out to Kowalski families across the state, explaining my situation and asking if anyone had information about a family member who had been in Ohio in 1991. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a DNA match on a genealogy website. A woman in her 60s named Barbara Kowalski matched me as a likely first cousin once removed. I sent her a message explaining my situation, and within hours, I received a reply that changed everything. Barbara was the sister of Anna Kowalski. She confirmed that her younger sister had become pregnant as a teenager and had been sent to live with relatives in Ohio until after the birth. Anna had returned to Pennsylvania, heartbroken over giving up her baby, and had rarely spoken of the child she placed for adoption. Tragically, Barbara informed me that Anna had passed away 5 years earlier from a sudden illness. The news was devastating. I had found my birth mother only to learn she was gone. But Barbara offered me something equally precious: connection. She shared stories about Anna, describing her as artistic and sensitive, with a love for photography and nature, traits I recognized in myself. She sent me photos of a young woman with my smile in my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I saw myself in someone else's face. Barbara also put me in touch with my biological aunt and uncle on my mother's side, as well as 2 cousins who were eager to meet me. They invited me to visit them in Pennsylvania, to hear more about Anna, and to see where she had grown up. As I packed my bags for the trip, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I was about to step into a world that was genetically mine, but culturally foreign. I would meet people who shared my blood, but not my memories. This journey wasn't just about finding my biological family. It was about integrating this new identity with the person I had always been. The youngest of 7, and now the only one who was adopted, was finally going home. The drive to Pennsylvania was filled with a nervous anticipation I had never experienced before. The 3-hour journey took me from the familiar flatlands of Ohio to the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, a landscape that felt both foreign and strangely welcoming. As I followed the GPS directions to the small town where my biological family lived, I practiced what I might say, how I might explain the 32 years that had passed without connection. Barbara had arranged for me to meet the family at her home, a modest brick house on a tree-lined street. When I pulled into the driveway, she was already waiting on the porch, her face breaking into a warm smile as she recognized me from the photos I'd shared. We embraced immediately, and in that moment, I felt an inexplicable sense of coming home. Inside, I met my Aunt Carol, Anna's older sister, and Uncle Tom, her husband. Their children, my cousins Michelle and Kevin, greeted me with genuine curiosity and kindness. We sat around the dining table, photos of Anna scattered between us, as they shared stories of the sister and mother I had never known. They painted a picture of a bright, sensitive young woman who loved art and nature, who dreamed of becoming a photographer. They explained that Anna had become involved with an older boy from a neighboring town, and when she discovered she was pregnant at 17, her conservative parents had sent her to live with relatives in Ohio to avoid family shame. Anna was heartbroken about giving you up, Carol told me, her voice thick with emotion. She talked about you often, especially on your birthday. She always wondered what kind of person you were becoming if you were happy. They showed me albums filled with photos of Anna, as a child with gap-toothed grins, as a teenager with the same thoughtful expression I often saw in my own mirror, and as a young adult before her illness. In these images, I found pieces of myself I had never recognized before. The curve of my smile, the way my eyes crinkled when I laughed, even my artistic sensibility. The most emotional moment came when Barbara handed me a small wooden box. "This belonged to Anna," she said softly. "She kept it with her always. We think she would want you to have it." Inside were a few cherished possessions. A silver locket with a tiny photo of a baby me, they confirmed, a collection of pressed flowers, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal contained Anna's thoughts and dreams, including several entries written after my birth, expressing her love and hopes for the baby she had placed for adoption. As I read these words, written decades ago by the woman who gave me life, tears streamed down my face. For the first time, I understood that my adoption wasn't a rejection, but an act of love, a sacrifice made by a young woman who wanted more for her child than she could provide at that time in her life. The visit also answered questions about my biological father. Anna had never revealed his identity to her family, maintaining that secret even after returning home. Though I still had questions about that half of my genetic heritage, I felt surprisingly at peace with this mystery. Anna's love and story were enough for now. Returning to Ohio, I felt transformed. The confusion and anger that had consumed me since discovering my adoption had been replaced by understanding and acceptance. I now had a more complete picture of who I was, a person shaped by two families, two histories, two sets of parents who had loved me in different ways. My relationship with my adoptive family remained complicated. I had several difficult conversations with my parents and siblings, expressing my hurt while also acknowledging their love and the life they had given me. We established new boundaries and more honest communication, though some relationships would never fully recover from the breach of trust. The most significant change was internal. I no longer defined myself as the only one who was adopted, but as someone who had been chosen twice. Once by a birth mother who loved me enough to give me a better life, and again by adoptive parents who raised me as their own despite their reservations. I continued to build relationships with my biological family, visiting Pennsylvania for holidays and sharing updates about my life. They welcomed me without reservation, embracing me as the missing piece of their family puzzle. A year after discovering the truth, I sat in my apartment looking at a new collection of family photos, images of me with my biological cousins, with my adoptive siblings of strained but genuine holiday gathering, and most importantly, a picture of just me, smiling with a confidence I had never possessed before. The DNA test that had shattered my world had ultimately given me a more complete understanding of myself. I was no longer just Samantha, the youngest of 7, or Samantha, the only one who was adopted. I was simply Samantha, a woman shaped by love, loss, discovery, and the complicated, beautiful tapestry of family in all its forms. And in that understanding, I finally found the peace and identity I had been searching for all along.